Well, I bought this old, it's a Giant Vac for the 8 horsepower Briggs Stratton to put on a mini bike that I'm building, but it doesn't have any spark. And I cleaned and gapped the points and still no spark, so I put a different set of points and condenser in and gapped them, still no spark. So we're going to check the magneto now. I've never really seen one of these go bad, so I don't know if it's bad or not, but we're going to use this Merc-o-tronic tester, and it should spark in that little window if the magneto is good. I do have charged battery in it. I think the battery's down in it. But we will test that magneto to see if it's bad. If it's bad, I'll have to scrounge around my junk of parts and see if I have another magneto for it. We'll get this 8 horse Briggs Stratton running. It'll be a good motor for the Harrison Wildcat mini bike I have. So I'll get the thing charged up and we'll try it out. Well, I got the tester hooked up. I took the ground off the coil. I put the one wire to the ground, took the condenser off and put the one to the positive side of the coil. The other connects to the spark plug wire. Then the tester, you turn that to coil power test, and then you turn that until you see some spark. And as you can see, it's sparking, so that tells me that coil is good. So we'll just clean up all the connections, and maybe I gotta put the recoil on and pull it over a little quicker to get spark. I was just turning the flywheel by hand. But we do have a good coil, and as far as I know, the condenser is good. I can test it with this. I think I will test it before I put it back together. Hold the camera. I need 2 hands here. Actually, I need 3. So this together, push the button, the meter reads. It's scale number 4. This is within the specifications of the Briggs Stratton engine, so we have a good condenser. Is reading right there on the number 4 of the scale. So we got a good condenser. The unit has to be plugged in to test for the condensers. Here's another one to test for a leakage and short test. This is the capacity, but generally if the capacity is good, everything else is good with the condenser. So I got good condenser, good coil. Maybe I was just not spinning the motor fast enough, so we'll give her another shot. Okay, to set the points on these, you move the condenser, so I like to snug this up and then just loosen it so I can move this. I usually just push on the bottom of the condenser like this. The gap is 20 thousandths on the points. The points are open pretty much all anywhere except for when the key slot's over here about 2 o'clock. I always like to close the points after I gap them to make sure they close evenly and snugly. You can bend this part of the point with a pair of needle noses if you need to and get it to where it closes nicely, and then recheck your gap. You might have to, I already did that, so I don't need to do it again. It's just slightly tight. I notice it's moving the upper, up the upper point when I snugged these up, because when you tighten them it tends to loosen pull the condenser down a little bit, and then you have to fiddle around. Briggs points are a little bit of a pain to set, but once you get them set, you're done. These rarely need to do anything with them. These are probably the original, well, the ones I took out were probably the original points. And this engine's a 1975, so it's a 41-year-old engine, and it's hard to gap points with one hand. So I may stop the video and then go back and gap them, but you get the picture. So that's a little stiff there. I'll tighten up the condenser, and now it might be just right. That's pretty good. It's a little snug, but it's pretty. The points cover's back on. I'll throw the flywheel and key back in. I did rotate it to make sure the point's closed and nice and snugly, and evenly, and they do. These have a little aluminum flywheel key. Sometimes they shear. They're designed to shear, so if you hit something and stop the motor suddenly, it shears the key instead of twisting the crankshaft. So throw the flywheel back on the engine, and to get these flywheels off, if they have been on for a long time, these holes are threaded. I put a puller on here, put a little pressure on it, tap the end of the puller with a hammer, and the flywheel pops right off. Sometimes if you don't have a puller, or these aren't tapped and you don't have a way of tapping them, you can pry on the back of the flywheel without, be careful you don't put a hole in the crankcase. Use a brass hammer so you don't mushroom this, hit this, and usually the flywheel pops off. These have a washer that is, you can't really see it there, but it's kind of spring loaded and it sticks out further than this side. That would be like so-called concave, that would be convex. Goes on, so the bumped out part goes there. You hear a lot of old Briggs squeal. That's the oil hole to oil at. There's a wick up in there. Make sure there's a little oil in the starter ratchet so they don't squeal. And then tighten that down. I have a special tool to tighten it down. Use a screwdriver to hold your flywheel. Be careful you don't snap these off. The cast iron's really brittle. Those will snap off real easy. I'm just going to put it on finger tight for now. Oh, and we have spark. I don't know if you can see that or not. It may not show up with the daylight, but it was sparking. So let's get this thing together and see if it cranks up. I haven't cleaned the carburetor yet. This thing's been sitting a long time with fuel in it. So I may have to clean the fuel tank and the carburetor. But we'll give it a try with 2-3 pulls first and see what happens, and if it doesn't get going, I'll pull a carburetor and clean it. And if I do, I'll show a video on how to do that. Well, it's like this. I got to pull the carburetor and clean it. It runs on gum out, but it does not run by itself. I did pressure wash it, so the air filter is all full of water, and there was water down in the carburetor. And you can see it leaving watering on the driveway there. So I'll pop the carburetor off, a couple screws here, a couple bolts there, take this assembly off. These screws, you got to take the main jet out, and then there's a rod, jet rod that goes up in here, comes out, and then the bowl will separate, and I'll replace the fuel line when I have the carburetor off. Get her all cleaned up. I did pressure wash it, that's why water ran out, why the air cleaner is full of water, but it runs on carburetor cleaner. So we'll get the fuel tank and the carburetor clean, and it should run good. Well, I'm going to take this carburetor apart. I took the main jet out. I went and got the tripod. This thing is just full of milky water and this nastiness. This is the main jet, and it's all corroded. So we'll take this jet out that's in here. You got to take these out before you take the top off, otherwise you'll wreck the carburetor. That's the jet. You can see what I mean by it's long, and that thing's that thing's totally plugged up. And you might as well take the low speed jet out too. In fact, when I count how many turns it's open, half, one and a half turns on the, this is the low speed. Take this gasket off so I don't wreck it, because I plan on reusing the gasket. That's the low speed needle. This is the high speed needle. That's the water, the crud that was in the carburetor. Some of that water I'm sure was from when I pressure washed it, but it looks like it's had water in it in the past from the corrosion on the main needle. And I'll tell you what works good to clean corrosion out of the bottom of these old carburetors is Snowball toilet bowl cleaner. It's a good, it's an acid, and it'll remove all the corrosion out of the inside of the carburetor, out of that brass tube, and get this thing cleaned out and back on the engine, and we'll have it running. Hopefully it'll start on the first pull. We'll see. I want to try and reuse the gaskets, that's why I tap it with a hammer. Ooh, there's a lot of crud in there. I can see it right now. Maybe going to the mower shop and getting a new float. I gotta get a razor blade to break that gasket free so I can reuse it. If I can avoid buying parts, it's awesome. I have to go get a part or two. That's the float, and it's a mess. Ooh, the needle valve is stuck in there. You can see all the corrosion in the float bowl. We'll get that cleaned out. We'll get that metering rod cleaned out. I'll shake the float, check the needle and seat. Hopefully we can have this thing running before the day is out. Well, I got the float pin out. It came right out. The needle valve doesn't look swollen, so I may be able to reuse that. And the float doesn't have any liquid in it, so I'll just clean the float up, and I think the float will be fine. And we'll put this carburetor back together and hopefully have it running. Usually you shake these and you can hear if they have water or gas in them. If these solder joints corrode, they'll leak and fill with gas, or in this case water, with all the water that was in the carburetor. I didn't really blast the carburetor that hard when I was pressure washing it, so I suspect that it had water in the carburetor already. And as with the corrosion in there, it looks like it's had water in it for a while, not just a couple. If this was just water from a couple hours, there wouldn't be any corrosion at all. You'd drain the water, gas the machine up, and it would fire right up. This has had water in it for a while, but it cleans up good. I think we'll have no problem getting this engine going as is with this, just by cleaning this carburetor up. That actually wiped out pretty good. There's a little corrosion in here. I'll just lightly, I'm not going to snowball this. This isn't that bad. I'm just going to hit it with some light emery paper in there, just take some of that surface corrosion off, and clean the jets. Same with this. I'll just clean that needle and seat, blow it all out with a gum out, throw it all back together, and hopefully we'll have this thing going. Hopefully I'm going to clean that, which is the fuel inlet where the needle goes. I'm going to clean this out, which is just like a bowl vent. The low speed idle mixture I'm going to clean out. They go little holes in the venturi in there. It should spray out there, and where it draws its gas up from, which is through that. The main jet, which is right here, I'll clean up. Clean all this, get everything cleaned out. Alright, I cleaned out the carburetor. Float's pretty clean. The float bowl, I mean, the float, the top of the carburetor. This is what they call an updraft. The air comes in here, goes through the center and through there. That's the throttle plate, so it's drafting up through the carburetor. That's why it's called an updraft. These are really super simple carburetors to work on. So the first thing to do is put the gasket in place on the top of the carburetor base. Put your needle valve back on the float. Set it back down in there. Put the pin in that holds the needle valve in place. This has a little corrosion on one side, so I may have to put it in from the other end altogether. This is the side I pulled it out of. So that's the float. installed, what I like to do is I like to, it's sealing, it's flowing, sealing. When that float is at the right level, it should be level with the, even with this part of the carburetor, so that gap should be even all the way around with this. That's the correct float setting on the carburetor. The next step is put the base back, the bottom of the carburetor back on. 3 little screws hold the top of the carburetor to the base. Some engines, this has one screw hole or one linkage hole for the governor. Some will have multiple. Make note of which one it's in so you get the governor in the right hole, so you don't overspeed the engine and blow the connecting rod. These engines are designed to run at 3,600 RPM. I usually put a tack on the end of the crank and adjust the governor so they run right at 3,600. Get the carburetor bases together and tightened up. Now on these, this is the main jet, and I don't know if it'll show up in this. There's little wee holes. There's one there, one there. There's one there, one there, one there, one there, one there, and one there. And then, of course, in the end, I like to put my finger over it, shoot gum out, make sure gum out comes through every one of those little tiny wee holes. Make sure they're all clear. If those are clogged up, the engine will not run. So just make sure all your little wee holes are clear. These ones are. This screws into the bottom of the carburetor. Just like it came out. This is the most important part. Sometimes you can just take this, turn your fuel off, take the main out, take this out and clean this, put it back in, and then usually the engines will start up. But I didn't know any history on this, how long it's been sitting, so that's why I decided to pull a carburetor. I got this from a guy on Craigslist earlier today, because I want to use the engine on that Harrison Wildcat mini bike I have, and I want to make sure it's a good engine before I go stripping everything apart. So that's why I want to get it running. If the engine runs good, then I'll have a good engine for my mini bike. So this is the main jet. Typically these screws are set at 1.5 to start with, so that's what I set them at. This was what the low speed mixture was. So I'll run this in, turn it out 1.5 turns. Don't reef them in. You can break the needles off in the inside the bore. So that's 1.5 turns. Half, 1/2. Those are good starting points to get the engine going and adjust the carburetor. That carburetor is completely overhauled, ready to go back on the motor. I am going to replace the fuel line between the tank and the carburetor before I put the carburetor back on, and I'm going to clean the air filter and put the air filter back in clean too before I crank it up. Alright, well I put the new fuel line on, but this engine doesn't have any water in the fuel tank that I can see, but there's a sediment bowl right there, and that's got water in it, so I'm going to take that off, and it's got a fuel shut off. I did shut it off. I got the new fuel line there, so I am going to shut that, take that sediment bowl off and drain it out. Thought I was. does. Usually, no, it does. Yep, it's full, 100% full of water. Well, there must be water in the tank because that's water. So I think we'll just completely drain the tank and put some fresh fuel. Well, I completely drained the tank. It was probably about half full, and half that gas that was in the tank was water. Throw the carburetor back on. First thing I do is hook the governor back up. Put the fuel line back on. Get the carburetor up into place. Start the 2 screws, which I think are in the garage, or they're in the air cleaner. Cover off, go get them. I just like to start everything. Oops, I need to put the gasket on there. That would help. Probably have to pick a new gasket up for here, the correct one. This isn't the correct gasket, and I don't have any in my parts hoard. We get the screws started on the carburetor, and this goes on. That's the breather that was started out with California emission engines. Instead of just dumping them out into the atmosphere, they run it back through the engine, burn it through the cylinder, and then the crankcase fumes come out the exhaust instead of just into the outside air. Push that back into the little breather. The crankcases typically run on a little bit of a vacuum on these motors. Whoops, I gotta take that screw back out because that's why I only put things together loose, because sometimes you gotta move things or do things like that. Right there is a perfect example why you leave things loose until you get it all in place. In fact, I may have to pop it back off to fit this. I can reach it. Well, no big deal. Should have put that in before I put this back on the motor. But seeing I didn't tighten anything up, it was no big deal. That's what holds the air cleaner on. A little more difficult to maneuver this stuff around. Put that in there. Again, just loosely put it together until everything's in place. Now let's tighten these in this time. And tighten this one up. Oops. Well, I cleaned the air filter. I like to use lacquer thinner to clean my air filters. It dries quick. And then I re-oil them with just the same oil I use in the crankcase, and that helps catch the dirt. So there's the air filter. Let's see if it cranks up and adjust the carburetor if it does. Again, I drained the oil out. You can see what was in it. It's kind of thin, so I don't know if that's gas. It's obviously not water because it would be gray if it was water. So Drained the oil out of the crankcase and refilled it. Let's see if it smokes like a crazy fogging machine again. If it does, it's done. I'm not going to put rings in it. I'll just get rid of it and find another 8-horse engine. It might smoke a little bit from the residual oil in it. We'll see. I guess I need to. The balls aren't catching in the recoil. I need to clean that. Engine seems to run better now that it doesn't have a half-gallon oil, but I can't get this to catch, and typically that's because when these are all greasy, these balls stick out here and don't go up against that ratchet, and that's why they don't catch. So the simple solution is clean this out, put nothing in it, don't put oil or grease in it. The only thing that should have oil in it is that wick down in here. You put your oil in that hole right there while this is on the engine. But we'll give this a good cleaning and put it back on the motor, and hopefully that will solve the starter catching problem. Alright, we're going to throw the starter ratchet back together. First thing, this little nylon washer, the ratchet, and this is all cleaned along with the inside of that. That wick is oiled there so it won't squeal on the crankshaft. And then you just drop these balls back, one in each hole, and all the balls are nice and clean. Then you put the cap back on, and then that's just held in place with the screws that hold the grass screen on. But you can see it catches on them all now, so now I won't be pulling a rope that's not engaging the engine. It was just grease holding the balls from floating down and catching. Well, it seems to run good, and I think that took care of draining over a half-gallon of gassy oil out of the crankcase. Got rid of most of the smoke. I think the smoke left is a residual that's probably in the carburetor that the breather pumped into it. And as it was running, it was smoking a little less and less, and I did run it. I took it out and blew all the front lawn and everything off, cleaned everything up. Seems to run pretty good. I think if I use it on the mini bike, I will put new piston rings in it, because that won't cost very much and won't take very long to do it. This was an engine I got. This 5-horse Briggs Stratton in an estate sale. I paid $5 for it. It was off a rotor tiller. It was white originally. I didn't rebuild it. I did just clean it up and paint it. I made that chain guard by hand. So you can see it looks pretty nice. I've ridden this quite a bit. It does, at idle, it'll puff a little smoke once in a while, just a little puff here and there. It bothers my brother. It doesn't bother me one bit, for it's so minuscule. Oil level never goes down in the crankcase. But that was a $5 estate sale engine. This engine here will go on the, if provided it has a straight crankshaft, will go on the Harrison Wildcat. I shoved those paper towels in there because the oil the breather pumped into the carburetor is still dripping out. When it's done dripping, I'll take the paper towels out of there. If it has a tapered crank, I'll weld the cracks up in the base, throw a coat of Rust-Oleum on the blower housing, and sell it. See if I can get $250, $300 for it. It starts on the first pull with the carburetor all cleaned out. I fixed the starter ratchet so it catches every time now, no problem. Starter ratchet's right there. See my fingers on it. So yeah, good running 8 horsepower Briggs Stratton. It blows good. Like I say, I cleaned the front yard, all the twigs and leaves and crap from the last storm off the front yard. It's completely clean. Blew it across the street, right into the yard across the street. Unfortunately, I'll have to go clean it up off their yard. I'll just go out there with a rake and pick it up. But that's kind of what I like to use for engines, is these old school side valve Briggs Strattons. And if you look at my past videos, you'll see the mini bike that engine there is going on. And I will repaint it, put new decals on it. That engine, when I'm done with it, will look as nice as this engine, provided I use it on the mini bike. If I leave it on the blower, it's going to remain looking like it does. The sun's kind of washing it out, but sweet running engine. I think that's little tiny bit of smoke that's coming out the muffler will ease up as the oil burns out of the muffler and out of the carburetor air horn. Thank you for watching my video.